the National Flash Fiction Day. Welcome to the National Flash Fiction Day. Oh, we're being paused. Okay, hold on. This is live, everybody. So
now we have a meeting is now streaming on
meeting
YouTube.
Is now streaming. Okay, I think we can start.
There you
Okay,
go.
great. So second attempt. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the National Flash Fiction Day New Zealand series of panel discussions. I don't know whether to say good morning, good evening, or good afternoon, because it's 10 o'clock in the evening here in the UK, but I think it's 9 a.m. in New Zealand, or parts of New Zealand at least, and in the afternoon for some of our audience, and indeed some of our, or at least one of our panelists. So anyway, we're here. National Flash Fiction Day New Zealand takes place on the 22nd of June. And this series of panels is part of the international celebration. The panels alone feature writers from New Zealand, the UK, America, Europe, India, Sri Lanka, Egypt, and there are many other readings available as well as the panels. You can find all the information you need about National Flash Fiction Day New Zealand at the website, which is nationalflash.org. So that's one word of nationalflash.org. And this panel is a discussion of the Novella-in-flash form, a form that has been bursting into the limelight in the last few years in particular, although it has roots that go back into the 20th century. We have 5 guests on this panel, and I don't think if you tried to accumulate a gaggle of flash fiction writers, you could find a gaggle that had won more awards than this crowd of writers. They've been placed in competitions all over the world, and really they should be competing in their own category so the rest of us actually have a chance. So I will introduce them in one by one. So first from New Zealand, we have Tracy Slaughter, who is a poet and writer of short fiction. Her first collection of poems and short stories was Her Body Rises, which came out from Random House in 2005. Her recent Novella-in-flash is If There Is No Shelter, and it was a runner-up in the 2020 Bath Novella-in-flash Award. And she has a collection of short stories just out, and I believe she has a copy right by her, and it's called The Devil's Trumpet, I think. Yes, there we go. Thank you, Tracy. So congratulations to Tracy for that recent publication.
Thank you.
We also have, representing both America and the United Kingdom as a honorary Brit now, Meg Pokras, who is the founding editor of Best Microfiction series and the founding editor of the online journal New Flash Fiction Review. She's the author of 7 prose collections and 2 novellas in flash, Here Where We Live, and most recently, The Lost Detector. And she has a microfiction sequence about to come out, is that right, Meg? Called
Yep.
Spinning to Mars?
Yeah.
And that won the Blue Light Book Award last year. So welcome, Meg. From the UK, we have Mary Jane Holmes, whose Novella-in-flash Don't Tell the Bees won the Bath Novella-in-flash Award in 2020. And she's also a poet with a collection Heliotrope with Matches and Magnifying Glass, published by Pin Drop Press. And her newest collection of flash fiction will be published by V Press later this year. Welcome, Mary Jane. From Iowa, we have Al Kratz, who's the managing editor at New Flash Fiction Review. So that's 2 of you representing the magazine today. And a 3-time shortlister at the Bath Novella-in-flash Award, which is remarkable because it's only been going for, I think, 4 years or 5 years. So his Novella-in-flash Off the Resting Sea was published by Above Ground Press just recently. And he has a new Novella-in-flash about to come out this year, which was in this year's competition from Ad Hoc Fiction. And I've been told to read this in a Tony Soprano voice, but I'm not sure I can manage that. But it's called The Tony Bone Stories. So perhaps Al will later do his Tony Soprano impersonation for us. Last but not least, representing Ireland and London, we have Tom O'Brien, who runs an online course introducing writers to the Novella-in-flash, and his own Novella-in-flash, Straw Gods, was published by Reflex Press, and he has 2 more due out this year, one from Retreat West and another from Ad Hoc Fiction. I don't have the titles of those written down, Tom, but perhaps you can let us know.
Absolutely, yeah. The Reflex Press Novella-in-flash that came out last year is called Straw Gods. The one coming out just in about a week and a half on the 23rd is part of an anthology from Retreat West, and it's called Homemade Weather. It's the title track, if you like, of the anthology. And later in the year, there's one for the river, which is from Ad Hoc, in the same group that came through with Al, who hadn't realized it was such a veteran. I'm in awe to be in the same company. That's quite something. So a busy year for me on that front as well. But it's
great. Well, congratulations again, Tom. So welcome to all of our panel. We're going to be discussing the Novella-in-flash. We may discuss it too, I don't know. But I'll put some questions to the panel, and there will be room for some audience questions too later on. So if you're watching live, and we are recording live, so please keep a note of your questions. And as they kind of accumulate, later on, I'll ask you to just type them into the chat, and then we can kind of field your questions and put them to the panel. I wanted to start before throwing the panelists their first question to just read an extract from this book. I don't know if you can see the title. It's called My Very End of the Universe, 5 novellas in flash and a study of the form. And it's a really important book in the history of the Novella-in-flash form. It came out in 2014 from Rose Metal Press. And it was the first publication that really had a kind of discussion about the Novella-in-flash form. There were some craft essays in it, and a brilliant introduction by the editors, Abigail Beckel and Kathleen Rooney. So I'm just going to read a little bit about the Novella-in-flash from the beginning of that essay by those 2 editors. So they talk about how the Novella-in-flash was a term that they settled upon gradually, and they'd heard various names for this strange emerging form appearing in their submissions pile, such as the flash fiction novel, the novella in shorts, the vignette novel, the flash novella, the novel in stories, and eventually the term that they chose to settle upon, which was the Novella-in-flash. And there's a rather lovely description they have of what the Novella-in-flash is, and I think it's just important to ground up our discussion in some kind of attempt at a definition. I'm sure our panelists will be talking about this later on, but here's one way of that they have described it. So one way to describe the interplay of flash fiction and novellas in flash is to think of each flash as a star. Stars stand alone. They appear in the sky as singular sparks of light, each one possessed of its own flickering beauty. In nearly every era and culture, humans have named the stars and taken those beloved luminous points and connected them in the sky into shapes and stories. Novellas in flash are like those constellations, writers linking their flashes together into a larger image, into narratives deep with possibilities. So I hope you have some sense there of how the novella in flash is a form that is gathering together individual flash fictions into something more substantial, a longer narrative, a bigger entity. So there's a sense that these things exist individually as flash fictions, but also in a unified way. So I want to start with a question to the panel, and I'll ask this to each panel member in turn. I'll bring you in individually. And actually, it's really 2 questions. So I wanted to ask, what made you want to write your most recent novella in flash? And also, can you tell us one thing about that novella in flash that readers wouldn't realize just from reading the book itself? Perhaps we could start with Tracy from New Zealand, representing National Flash Fiction Day first.
Thank you. The story that's at the core of my novella, if there is no shelter, arose from a sense of a trauma, which was a national trauma for us here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, which was the Christchurch earthquake. And although I don't name Christchurch, and it's not a specific location within the book, the story really is an attempt to trace the aftermath of a quake, and it traces a heroine picking up the pieces in the aftermath of that level of devastation. So that was the driving force, but I had no idea how to start until I was standing in my staff room in the middle of an incredibly overloaded teaching day, switching on the kettle with that kind of 1,000-yard dazed stare that you get when you've been teaching for hours, and noticed the emergency poster on the wall of the staff room that had a list of things to do if various, tragedies broke out in the middle of our ordinary day. And one of them had the heading, "If there is no shelter," and gave a list of things to do. And my eye just caught that line, and it was literally just ignition. As soon as I saw it, the heroine just flashed in to being, and I knew I had a story right there in that moment. It was like encountering that star, just and just that sense of her and her story, just transmitted through that single line, kind of lit up the rest of the stars in the hemisphere. So I was really gripped. That's the strange beginning, a staff room wall poster that I imagine people wouldn't guess, although the emergency instructions became structural in the novella, in that each fragment is given a line from a emergency poster, which I gathered as I travelled around afterwards.
That's really interesting to hear that process described, Tracy. I might come back and ask a follow-up question later on, if I may. For now, let's move on to Tom. Would you like to address this first question? So what made you want to write your recent Novella-in-flash, and can you tell us one thing about it that readers wouldn't necessarily know?
Yeah, it was born initially as a short story that I could never quite land, and I put it away. It was fine. I sort of enjoyed it and thinking, okay, I'll return at some point. And the Retreat West had this idea for the Novella-in-flash, and I had done Straw Gods, so I, being cocky, thought, well, I can do this now. So off I go. I'll go break this down. And the story had completely different ideas. It became the bones of the initial story. I don't think I ever even gave it a title, but it became the bones of homemade weather. But actually all that ended up was, if you like, the third act was the story. And I thought, well, I'll go into it, I'll break it down, see what's going on and see what comes out. And it just kept going backwards and backwards and backwards into, so why is she like that? Why did that happen? What about, okay, now she's a teenager, now she's a child. And it gave me a starting point when Celia, my main character, was a young girl, which in the initial story, she was someone nearing the end of her life. So I just traveled back and back. And each time it was, well, okay, now she's got a dad. How do they get on? She's got a dog. How do they get on? And things happen. And then having found that starting point, so it's the reverse of all the good advice of start late. It felt like I'd started way too late because all the interesting stuff was actually back at the start when I went searching for it. And then, so I now had a beginning and what I thought would be an end. And then it was a quick question of finding whatever was in between and breaking it. And again, it was a process of just breaking out what was there, making them, that's why the idea of them being micros was very helpful, because you're always just aiming for the smallest thing that can be anything. And then once I'd lined those up, like stars or marbles or whatever. They were in a row and they were mine to move around. And then I sort of jokingly gave it a sort of book 1, book 2, book 3, thinking for this tiny little story. But actually that stayed, that made it to the end. There were very much 3 discrete parts to it that evolved. And that was not me, that was not the plan. The plan was just to expand and explode this story. But it decided it wanted to be 3 mini stories that are very much with the same character running through them. But they're quite different. They're from different eras of her life with different characters that Celia's encountering. So I started out with one thing in mind and ended up with something entirely different, but it did include the initial sort of gestation device of the story that I was breaking apart. So that was my process for this one. Straw Gods was written completely differently, and One for the River, the one comes after, all completely differently. So I'm discovering that no, the story will decide how it wants to be written, not me. That seems to be the lesson I'm getting from this. In terms
That's
of things
really
that people,
interesting, Tom. Yeah.
it was. I can call it interesting now. It wasn't at the time. I felt I was getting kicked up and down the screen. Like, oh, now what? I really need to get on with this. Particularly as there was a deadline. I wanted it ready for a competition because that kept me honest in terms of sticking at it each day and not wandering off. But that helped focus it, but it still wasn't this linear thing that I would have predicted, whereas Straw Gods actually probably was a slightly more linear process in that I'd
Can I
never
ask
done
a
one before. And
question,
I started,
Tom?
yeah,
Sorry to
fire away.
interrupt. I just want to ask you to just quickly define for people who are listening what a novelette in Flash is and how it might differ from a novella in Flash.
Yeah. Well, we have the definer here actually in the panel, but yeah, in terms of what Retreat West set as the boundaries, they identified this little niche between a short story and a novella. Word count, I guess we all sort of vaguely keep an eye on the sort of Hugo Awards, seem to call it maybe 16,000 is the sort of the roof for a novella. And so a novelette, the top on this thing I think was 7,000. Maybe it was higher than that. I can't quite remember, but mine came in at about 7,500. So it is word count, at a very mechanical level. I read a lot about scope, and that isn't my experience with it. That a novella will have this sort of narrow focus on something smaller than a novel, and a novelette smaller, and yet Homemade Weather covers someone's lifetime. So they'll be what they will be. It is following one character, and there's not much in the way of subplots, but there is room to do a huge amount even in this very small space.
Yeah, so the definition for the competition was about word count. Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, and it had the added layer of microfiction that each individual
chapter has to be a microfiction. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and that seems to make a lot of sense for a novelette. Yeah.
And a microfiction in the competition was defined as how many words? 500. Okay, yeah, because I think people have different definitions, don't they?
No, that's right. They are
500. Yeah.
Yeah, but
okay.
We seem to be settling on a few. Yeah, that's cool. Cheers.
Okay. So what I'm hearing from what you said was that you were kind of working backwards and asking questions, which is a really interesting way of working. And I think we're going to get deeper into kind of talking about process and how did people's novellas in Flash emerge as our conversation proceeds. I'd really like to bring in Meg now, if I may. Hi, Meg. Can I ask you again the same question as I've asked everyone else, which is what made you want to write your most recent novella in Flash? And can you tell us one thing about it that readers wouldn't necessarily know?
Well, the Novella-in-flash sort of found me. I wasn't looking for it. I mean, there was no conscious intention to write this Novella-in-flash with either The Lost Detector or with Here Where We Live from the Rose Meadow Press. For me, the process originally involved individual flashes, writing. I kept writing flashes about these characters that I didn't know were connected. And I didn't realize that I was shooting for something longer. And I just kept writing these coming of age stories involving young female characters. And I've always loved coming of age fiction stories about characters dealing with those treacherous and important moments, when you're sort of half child, half adult. And my first collection of Flash fiction, Damn Sure Right, is filled with stories like that. So I just kept writing them, and I wasn't sure, you know, what I was aiming at. I was just writing them. They were just coming out of me. So for me, the process involved eventually realizing that they belong together, and then digging back into my own archive and searching for these pieces that really felt like they fit and created a narrative arc. And they involved looking back at my old poems from 20 years ago, looking back at really old pieces, and realizing that they were being written really about the same character, but it wasn't conscious when I was writing the pieces. So I think I had a very different process than a lot of other people. I just kept writing these stories, and it wasn't like I said to myself, oh, now I'm going to write a story about this character. They just kept coming out of me. It's like I couldn't stop them. And so eventually, when I put them together in these Novellas-in-flash, I wrote connective tissue chapters to make sense of them and to create a narrative arc. But I also want to say that, so with Here Where We Live, which was my first Novella-in-flash from the Rose Meadow Press, and with The Lost Detector, which came out recently, they were originally the same. They were part of a much longer Novella-in-flash. I had sent that much longer piece. It was like a 20,000 word manuscript to the Rose Meadow Press, and it came in second in their contest. And then they wrote to me and said, hey, we're doing this anthology called Here Where We Live, and we loved your piece. It didn't win, but we loved the voice. Could you write a smaller piece for us? So they basically queried me for it. So that's how I ended up with that, with Here Where We Live in the Rose Meadow Press anthology. And then The Lost Detector, which came out recently, is another part of that original longer Novella-in-flash. So, I guess if there's some secret about it, it's really that I finally realized that really all the stories are about me. I mean, I'm really the main character in all of these pieces, and it's really kind of a memoir, although a lot of the characters are, you know, fictional. It feels they both Novellas-in-flash really feel like memoirs to me.
Okay, that's really interesting, Meg. And what I'm hearing so far is just the sheer variety of process from the three people who've spoken so far. We've had Meg, who's talked about really not necessarily knowing that she was writing a Novella-in-flash, just wanting to keep writing about this situation or this character and something emerging, and then filling in the gaps, and then even like shaping the material after a request from a publisher, kind of retrospectively. And then Tom talking about a really intentional process of wanting to write something for a competition in a certain shape and just asking lots of questions about a particular character and building from there. Both of you, Tom and Meg, did talk about that kind of connecting process. Tom, you talked about linking up in the middle, and Meg, you talked about the connective tissue. So perhaps that's something we can come back to later about how we link together material, standalone chapters, and how we link together material and how that kind of magic happens. And Tracy, your process sounds almost sort of miraculous, that it was almost just a sort of brainwave standing in front of a poster, and there's some kind of mystery there of its own kind. I'd really like to hear now from Al. Al, can you tell us maybe you know, what made you want to write yours, and perhaps also a little bit about processing that, like how did it emerge, just picking up on these themes that are emerging in what people have said so far.
Yeah, my star, or the light that I had, was kind of like Tracy's. I saw a character on the news, and his name was Tony Bone. I should say I saw a person on the news, and I turned him into a character. And we knew right away when we heard that name and we saw this news story that he had to be a character. And I knew that day I had to write the Tony Bone story. It was kind of weird. I knew I was going to do it. And then I had my writers group, was called the Flash Monsters, and we were meeting every week. And so I was reading them the stories as I was writing this, and it was fun to actually get feedback kind of while I was writing it and get a response and kind of know how people were reacting to my character and where I was going with the story. And the other thing that drew me to this and made me want to write it was 2020 and the whole existential dread that was, sitting at home, working from home, not having a difference between my work office and my writing office, just the whole what's going to happen to us and what does existence mean really became on the forefront for me. So I kind of worked all that through Tony Bone. He kind of helped me. And then I know we were talking about, things that you wouldn't know from the novel or something quirky about the novel. And I think for mine, I put all of that in the novel. Like, I don't have anything left to tell you about Tony Bone because it literally all went into there, including that he's a character. So I even, in my stories, there's a meta narrative. So I even am flat out, I'm a character in the story too. And my discovery of Tony Bone is the first story. And so we kind of like solved the story writing together. And I even involved the reader in it somewhat. And so it really made, I don't know, it made 2020 a super positive experience for me. So I'm really glad I wrote it.
That's really nice. It's kind of speaking to the therapeutic power of creativity and how it can be such a consolation for so many of us. It's nice that you mentioned that, Al. Thank you. Can I ask a follow-up question from what you've said, Al, which was that your novella, the one that's coming out from Ad Hoc Fiction, as you've said, is called Tony Bone Stories. But it's a Novella-in-flash. It's not a collection of stories. Would you describe it as a collection of stories, or is there something that makes it more than a collection of stories, even though that's the title?
Right. I knew it does have an arc, and it isn't what I considered the Novella-in-flash, and that was my goal that I was shooting for the whole time. I didn't do a lot of outlining, but I knew from the beginning that I wanted Tony to have to deal with his existence and what he thought about it, even to the point of what did he think about being a fictional character. And I also wanted him, he's a strong man for the mafia. He collects debts. And so I wanted him to philosophically approach that idea. And so he faces the idea whether he should be doing that, whether it's morally right or not. And so I did have an idea that we were going to get to an end point that he had to finally decide. That was a decision he had to make. And so each of those stories, we kind of worked through that.
I see. So there was a primary question that a character was tackling all the way through that manuscript, and you were answering that through the different stories. Okay, that's really helpful. Thanks, Al. Last but not least, let's turn to Mary Jane. Mary Jane, could you tell us a little bit about your most recent Novella-in-flash? I don't know if you've written more than one, but I certainly know Don't Tell the Bees.
I've only written,
And if you can tell us about that and a little bit about your process.
Why I've only written one is, I wrote Don't Tell the Bees kind of out of desperation because I couldn't find another way to write it. And actually the very end of the universe and Meg's work in there was in some ways a star for me, because I had, a lot of this is biographical in that I was in France in the 80s, even though I've set the Novella-in-flash in the 60s. These wonderful, rich characters, this place that I lived, all these things going on. And it's interesting, that sort of biographical, autobiographical, that what do you do with it? And there's so much of it. And as a poet and a short story writer, you can take an anecdote and do something with it, but to do all of that, I didn't have as poets and short story writers are, we're sprinters rather than marathon runners. So I knew I wasn't going to spend years writing a novel. I just, that was out of my comfort zone. And the Novella-in-flash was pretty much the only option I could find that could combine what I'm sort of comfortable with, which is the short form brevity, and also explore that sort of explosion of how you can expand that into something else. So I've taken anecdotes of characters that exist. The only one that is fictitious is the protagonist. She doesn't exist in real life. She is, as we were talking about, connective tissue. She became my connective tissue to kind of show this lived experience, my lived experience in some ways, of people that I'd met. And I had initially wanted to write the story of Maurice, who falls off the church, and have it as his story, because my neighbour did actually fall off a church and survive. And I wanted to tell his story. It didn't work out that way in the end. But so it came from very much a biographical or an anecdotal, and it was using a fictitious protagonist. I could bring all those things I wanted to together. So that was really my process. Desperation.
Yeah, thank you, Mary Jane. What really landed with me there was how, as someone that writes poetry and short stories, you were drawn to the combination of the brevity and the ability to expand, and that somehow that was it fitted you, you felt, and also that was a very rewarding and satisfying fusion of impulses for you to explore through the form. And another thing I heard was that you talked about the biographical element, and Meg mentioned how her stories, her coming of age stories, were revolving around secretly around her. And Tracy has talked about how she was writing about the Christchurch earthquake. So we've got a variety of ways to approach biographical information, real life. Al's talking about the character that he'd actually seen, or a person that he'd seen on TV that he adopted and then chose to write about. So there's a range of different approaches I'm hearing here about how to harness real life in your fiction. I'd like to put a question to everyone, and just volunteer yourselves forward to decide who's going to speak first. So I want to talk about the narrative arc in particular for your novella, because we've mentioned that this constellation of material, this constellation of individual stars, has some kind of link, has some kind of forward movement or arc. So did you know where your novella was headed? And if you didn't know where your novella was headed, can you explain a bit more and expand on how you figured out that map? Who would like to go first?
I can say for me, I lean heavily on story. I didn't realize that as I was writing sort of separate pieces. It's only when I started trying to put flashes together that I realized that that's how I find out about the characters. I don't generally know a whole lot about them until I have them doing things or things happening to them and how they respond. And it's over that process then that the novel, the piece, whatever shape it's in, moves backwards and forwards. But that's I need a thing, a hook to hang it off of, even if it's not where I end up using, but only by putting them under some sort of story pressure do I find out what they're about, and then I find out how they interact with someone. It's not something I've tried being character driven before, and it just isn't me. It's not how I write. It's not how it comes out. But I do find then when I go back to after a first draft or as it's evolving, it becomes more of a character piece, having had some kind of spine at some point that gave me something to work on, a vessel to fill. And then as I say with Homemade Weather, I actually knew the ending always, because that initial story had been written years before, and it was just a case of going back and back. That ending then changed quite significantly once I got to know more about Celia and who she was and how she'd respond. The character, I could say that the initial story failed because I didn't know her well enough, or I didn't get her right. And then as I saw her life and got to that set of stories again, I knew her very well by then. And the way she responded, the choices she made were a little bit different, even though the sort of hook of the story is that Celia is someone who believes that she can sign her life away, that she believes somewhat magically. That may or may not be the case, but it's about sacrifice, it's about guilt, it's about not being able to be enough ever for whatever reason. And I knew that at the end, but it's then when I applied it to her in different areas or different stages of her life that it became apparent, oh, this is who she is. She's not like the thin character I thought she was. She's much more rounded and developed. So story,
Okay.
that's how story works for me. And I need it to get anything done.
Would someone else on the panel like to pick up on what Tom's saying there about being driven by story and either
well, just before actually, I can say, just to be Tracy's book was a massive help for me at that time, because I had written lots of Novella-in-flash in that area, and I was like in awe of these people who were able to write this loose, drifting, episodic, mood-driven stuff and something like that. That's great. And then I read Shelter, and it was, here's a story, here's a thing where things move forward and one thing follows another, and it was like, you can do, that's okay, you can do that. And that just, you know, those lulls that we have every now and again was going, this is nonsense, why am I doing this? It was at that point I read that, and it was, yes, it's not linear, it's not as simple as that, but it's got a spine, it's got an arc, you move from one end of it to another. And it was exciting. It was like reading a thriller, or certainly a drama, as opposed to maybe something more poetic, which I had loved from afar. Whereas this was I can identify with this. This is someone telling a story with people in it, and that was a huge help. So that was one I can
Tracy,
definitely point
would you
to
like
as a
to pick
real
up on that?
talisman.
Yeah, I'm astonished and deeply excited to hear that my work connected in such a
It really did,
a fruitful way. Like that really is startling, and all the more so because I would never describe myself as being story driven. Funnily enough, I'm the reverse in that I always begin.
It feels
with
that book
character.
is though quite strongly story. I mean, that's what I took from it.
Yeah,
was you know because
that's actually wonderful to hear, because my process is much more instinctive, and it's about embodying the character first, and usually it is that sensory inhabitation of character that gives me all of the moments that kind of lights up that network of moments in their life where the pressure's on, the heat is turned up. And it was very much for me a process of embodying her and traveling within her as she processes the trauma that she's gone through, that those around her have gone through, and tries to kind of navigate her way back through a dismantled landscape where there is nothing linear really left anymore. So I feel very encouraged that someone
that was there for me anyway. Absolutely.
It's really fascinating.
The driving story of what had happened to her before and where she very much wanted to be with the other relationships. It was like, well, that's story stuff. A thing happened and made another thing happen. It's like, okay, that's good. That's what I took from that.
I guess that the backstory was there, straight away. I knew it wasn't just a story about, the quake bringing her world to the ground, but that she was actually destroying her world piece by piece through her own involvement in an adulterous relationship. So the kind of nexus of those two stories was the catalyst. And drove the pieces as they move forward.
That's interesting, Tracy. So I'm hearing that there were two story impulses that kind of collided.
Yeah, and I don't actually understand how they did. They did literally just in that first moment of ignition. But
it's that moment, public and personal, isn't it? Really, I mean, you've got this sort of this public thing that's happening, and then this personal thing that's collided with it and sort of deflected what might have been the path that she took.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that has always struck me about, these kind of national emergencies or national traumas, is that within those big public moments, there are all these tiny individual traumas or experiences still going on. Women are still having babies. couples are still breaking up, you know. So it was the kind of collision of those two things, I think. None of that was conscious, strangely enough, you know. It's just that unconscious explosion of the star, I think, that sets you on the pathway. But for me, finding that path is always about getting into the skin of a character who's going through it and really living in that body. So it's really fascinating to hear other people's processes.
Would someone else like to pick up on what Tracy's been saying?
Well, for me, I had all these wonderful characters, and I was sort of there wasn't a story really. There were these things that had happened to people, and I wrote them as if each piece was the opening of a story, as you do, you know, as you write into a story. So this will be the first paragraph of a short story. So that was my process. And then I sort of took that idea, I think that Charles Baxter talks about, of not looking at conflict, but at counterpointing characters. So you displace conflict by counterpointing. You put these characters all together. I mean, you could stick them in a lift if you wanted, but these were all people living in a village, and I wanted the village to be the collective sort of chorus of a Greek tragedy as well. They always talk about what's going on, and they're actually the most insidious character in the end. But I wanted to counterpoint and see what happened, and actually it didn't work. It needed this, as Tom said, it did need a story to come along, and that was totally just a made up thing that was used to push this counterpointing of these characters that already I'd written as first paragraphs of something. So that was really my always write as if it's the first paragraph, I think, of something.
What about for Meg or Al? How does that compare? Character, story, where do you sit on this fence? Is it a fence that we have to sit on?
In Here Where We Live with the Rose Meadow Press, I was really lucky that the editors, Abby and Kathleen, were really responsive readers who helped me to determine sort of what kind of narrative arc worked really well for that particular piece. I mean, as a flash writer, this was new territory for me. So they wanted a fairly conventional narrative arc, and they made that very clear. And this was a real challenge. There were so many ways that the story could go. Now, I think part of the problem for me with that character was because she was an unreliable narrator who was coming, you know, into her time and didn't really know where her life was going to go. It made it hard for me to determine where the story was going to go. So, I mean, if she was leading the way, she was a very difficult character in that respect. So I really sort of had to play it by ear. And I experimented with lots of different narrative arcs and eventually found the one that they felt really worked best for the novella as a whole. With the other Novella-in-flash, with the Lost Detector, there is no overriding narrative arc. Each character has their own quiet individual narrative arc, including the animals in the piece. And I found that for that particular piece, that worked best. So I really think it's case by case and it's book by book.
That's interesting, Meg. Yeah. How about for you, Al?
Yeah, I think from the sounds of it, I really did a mixture of what those approaches. I think I had the high level story. I knew I had this objective that I wanted the character to deal with, but after that I just kind of was going off the instinct and letting it take me where it took me. And when I wrote the last two stories, it was all in a pretty fast flurry, and I've described it as like the going down on the roller coaster at the end, or even swirling down the drain. It just kind of took me, and I knew I was just on a momentum, and I knew I was going to the ending, and so it felt good. It was one of my favorite writing experiences, and I think it's just that instinct sometimes is a fun thing to follow, as well as an outline.
Does anyone have a reaction to what Al's just said about instinct and following instinct?
It's just amazing that you knew where it was going. You knew your ending.
Yeah.
Because I think sometimes that is, unattainable.
Yeah, I was lucky.
Yeah, and also there's a real freedom, isn't there, when you have that, because you have your sort of true north. So you can go wandering off wherever you want, but you sort of know I can get back on this path. And certainly for me, mostly knowing, sometimes guessing, I'll get there and now I can go over here a little bit, but I don't want to go way off here because I'm contradicting myself. That's why, I mean, that's why it sounds so incredible what Meg did. If she has an unreliable narrator layered upon flash fiction making a story, which is already tricky to hold the sense of it together, so you just made it doubly hard, because I mean, I find it hard folding the facts of the stories in so that they move from story to story to story, and that it's not just a sort of a collection, but actually to give yourself someone who's I'm not sure if we can take this at face value. That's just an extra layer of it's depth and texture, but it strikes me as really hard, that sort of aspect of it to because I one of the things, and I think I take your point as well about having someone read it like an editor to guide you, is I thought with any of the books actually that at times I think I'm layering it on way too thick. And so you're saying that again, because you tend to have to say things a couple of times, maybe more than you would in a straight novella, because the stories stand alone. It's just a mechanical thing that you end up, and this is the time she went to the farm. And so you've said about the farm before, but it's that idea of having to, I thought I was going wildly over the top, and someone read it and said, "Oh no, I missed all that a bit about the farm." So it's that balancing act of not, and that's when you're only trying to say it for real, as opposed to sort of say it and this person may be lying or maybe untrustworthy. You say, well, that's a real balancing act, But that's all part of, I think, the Novella-in-flash idea is that you want them to stand alone, but then you want them to have this cohesive quality for a story, and at times I find anyway, you have to do things that don't come completely naturally, that you have to sort of say, okay, we're going to mention that thing again about the horse or whatever it is. I don't know why I got all these power metaphors, but it's just part of the mechanics of it. It's just remind the reader that this happened, like in on a cop show or something, that there'll be that sort of ominous music when the gun is put under the cushion. Sort of, okay, you're laying it on a bit thick, but thanks, because I would have forgotten about the gun otherwise. It's that sort of thing. Because I know when we were talking earlier, the idea of just the mechanics of flash in a novella, that's one of the things that you were talking about, connective tissue. That's actually one of the reasons I ended up writing Straw Gods as a Novella-in-flash, was to avoid all that connective tissue, because I get really bogged down in it. Just walking someone down a street, just going, why am I writing this? But in my head, I feel I need to move them around properly. Whereas when you're writing flash, you can just totally drop all that. In fact, you absolutely can't have it. It's not a story. It's not a standalone story. And I think that's hugely freeing when writing pieces of flash that will become something larger. You get the best of both worlds. I can get out now. I don't have to worry about how she pays the rent or whatever it is. That's not my problem in this story. I find that very freeing in the form.
Yeah. I would 100% agree with that. And I don't think this novella would have come into being had I not had that realization. Because even though, like you were saying, I had the miraculous beginning of the story, and I wrote quite a bit of it in that state of just exhilarating, being in the grip. Then I stopped trusting my instincts, and I started to try and push it in a different direction with all that connective tissue, to try and, get it to move to greater length. And it really was after some struggle that I had that realization that the brokenness of these fragments was the form of the story. It wasn't a story about a nice linear smooth path, because her landscape had been cracked and fractured. So it really was that revelation that my initial instincts to write it in fragments was the kind of was the mode of delivery. And so abandoning all that old traditional structural connectivity.
How did he get there? Exactly.
And just letting her pick moments out of the rubble and reflect on those. That was the thing that gave me the freedom to then reconnect and take it to completion. Yeah.
And also we have that thing that for the reader, that finding patterns and actually doing the narrative leap themselves makes them active participants in the story in a way that you don't get in any other form, I think. Some people might say, oh, you have to work harder as a reader, but that's the aerobics, get in there and do the work. I think for readers, the building of the imagination in the mind, which is what we just put down the bare minimum for everyone else to take and run with it. And I think that's what the Novella-in-flash is so good at doing, is allowing the reader to take it and run with it and leap and hurdle between these fragments. And I think it's just, for that, it's just a fantastic genre.
I want to ask a question following up from what Mary Jane said, but before I do, I also want to say to people that are watching that if you have questions that you would like to put to the panel, please do so now. Just type them into the chat. And I think you're on a couple of minutes lag, so we will find out about those questions in a couple of minutes time, and then we can try and squeeze as many as possible in. We may run over the hour slightly unless anyone has to disappear, but oh, we have a question already. So here we go. I'm wondering this is from Janice Liagra. Hello, Janice. I'm wondering how important you think it is, if at all, to get feedback on the individual parts of the novella as you're going along, or should you wait until it's finished? Wow, what a question. That's a really good one, Janice. So what do people think about that? How important is it to get feedback on the individual parts as you go along, or should you wait until it's finished?
I could see it being as harmful as it is helpful in some cases, possibly. I've done it both ways, and I did write Tony Bone where I was sharing it with multiple people each week. I don't know if it changed the way I was writing it, but I also can see putting your head down and just getting it all done. So I think it probably just is going to depend. Yeah, but where I'm wondering about if it'd be harmful is just if you're letting them get you off of those instincts that we talked about earlier. If you're letting even the experience of sharing that somehow get you off track of some instinct that you would have gotten to on your own in your tunnel. But
I think in terms of that discipline of something has to be standalone, if that is the discipline of the Novella-in-flash, you will have people, your readers, your trusted readers or your editor will go, doesn't feel like a standalone. I think that's good input. But then, there is that balance that it is standalone, but it has all this sort of sphere, this spider web around it that people can go, oh no, I don't know, I didn't understand that, so that image didn't make any sense to me, but that image is actually very important to somewhere else. So it's pitching that thing of it has to be standalone, it has to make sense. At the same time, there's that sort of vague area. So I think you take, as Al said, with a pinch of salt. But I think your own instincts are, yes, they're right. It doesn't make any sense on its own is a valid point if someone said that.
I think working with an editor who really understands a form deeply is crucial, or else just trusting your own instincts. Like in my case, working with Abby and Kathleen at the Rose Meadow Press made the hugest difference for me with my first Novella-in-flash. I don't think I could have done it without them. They would say, this piece isn't really a standalone flash yet. It needs more work. It needs more spark, And they'd also say, but it's not, leading toward the narrative. So they could see it from many different angles. And I trusted them implicitly because they were geniuses at it. I don't think I could have worked with many other editors. Otherwise, I'd rather sort of trust myself. So I think it's really case by case and writer by writer. But if you're going to work with an editor on the Novella-in-flash, I say work with someone who's vastly experienced and probably has done it themselves successfully.
I nearly, in fact, abandoned this novella, the Crisis of Faith. Strangely enough, after having been gifted it with such kind of miraculous force, then the crisis got so bad at one point that I nearly considered just dropping it. But before I did that, I showed it to two incredibly trusted friends who are also writers. And I'm so glad that I did, because they saved it. Really, they pulled it back from the brink that it was just about to tip over, and said, I think they were part of that revelation that the fragments are the point. Let it stay as it lays, effectively, and don't try and twist it into a false kind of completion that doesn't need to have. So it was kind of resuscitated at quite a crucial moment through sharing it with other people.
I have another question. I don't know who this is from, but it's from our audience. So was there an edit you found hard to make, or a particular flash you'd initially included that you had to discard? And perhaps it's implied that discarding it was a struggle. So yeah, was there an edit you found particularly hard to make, or a flash that you felt disappointed in having to discard?
I had a whole
Sorry.
Go on, Tracy.
What leapt to mind was I actually had another whole character in play in the longer version, and I still mourn for them a little bit. They didn't work ultimately. It needed to be in the final form that it is, but I got attached to them, and so there's a little part of me that still wishes that they were alive and kicking within the pages. So that was a tough edit.
And Tom?
Yes, I was just going to say that in One for the River, which drew out later, I had a couple of scenes that I had picked from my life, and work stories around those, just to use the framework. And I found those a little bit harder to take out than I should have, because they had more power for me than they had on the page. I remembered, and that might have been a failure of writing, but I think it was a structural thing that I wanted them to be in there because I remembered that place being like that. And just as I was pushing through, I kept getting sort of stuck around this area. And as soon as I plucked it out, it seemed to free up everything else. So I think there is that moment of just snipping something that's not working, even though you think, I will put it back in. You're lying to yourself, you won't. But it will. It then allows everything else to move around and free up to the way it should have been. But I sort of just wanted it there because, well, that was me in that one. There was an element of that. And so that's a specific memory I have from that one, that a couple of things just had to be taken out, and then it just let that minor character, but it allowed his story then to flow forward without me forcing in, but I want this, that's just not okay. In the end, draft 2, draft 3, draft 7, that it at some point is going to have to go. So you might as well put it aside early, and if you can work it back in, great. But in my case, probably won't. It'll have to turn up somewhere else as something else. So yeah, that's definitely, they have to go. Which is galling.
We're approaching the hour mark. Is everyone okay just to keep going for 10-15 minutes? Because I think we're starting to get a few more questions, and we're having more of a kind of free-for-all discussion, which I think is really interesting, rather than me putting questions to people. So if people can keep going for 10-15 minutes, I think it would be great. So should we do that?
Yeah.
Okay, so here's another question I'm reading from the chat box here. They're being forwarded to me by some mysterious process. Were any of the separate flashes previously published? This is from the same anonymous person that asked the last question. So yeah, anyone want to pick up on that? Individual flashes that had been previously published before the book or pamphlet came out.
On all of mine, I did not publish any of them individually. And I intentionally kind of did that. I know that they all stand alone, but I always felt like it was a united we stand, divided we fall kind of thing. I still wanted them to be together. That was just how I've always felt about them and approached it.
Yeah, I didn't
I had a
publish any of
few,
mine individually either. And for that same strange sense that there was just something, I don't know, sacred is a very loaded term, but there's some kind of aura that gets wrapped around them, especially while you're still working, where I felt that none of them wanted to be off, you know, having a separate existence.
Quite the opposite for me. I published many of them, and they slightly shifted. They were slightly edited differently, and in some points they were quite different endings, so that they would. Because I don't know how other people find with. Certainly for my work, I kind of would shift the flashes around and have a different story, and then go into that sort of crisis of, ooh, so if I do that, but then I'd have to change the ending of that, you know, and you have that sort of existential crisis of what, you know, how many stories are there. So I did publish quite a lot, but I was working on it.
Almost all of mine were published in various magazines over the years, and then I would change the stories to fit into the novella. So
yeah.
Did you find it helpful, Meg, to publish them?
I wouldn't say helpful. I hadn't known I was going to be writing a novella when I published them. So they just came out.
Yeah.
And then I ended up changing them later, but that wasn't a problem. I thought it was kind of nice to put them together into something.
Yeah.
I think either way is completely fine, you know.
Yeah.
Tom?
Yeah, I had a little, after Straw Gods was picked up by Reflex, I had put out 3 of the stories, just submitted them around various magazines, and I had to sort of ask, is it okay that I can put them anyway? I didn't know it was my first book, so but I had put them out almost the inverse, not to be sacrilegious, but to see if they could stand alone. There was that, it was to sort of test the opposite, because by then I was so sort of blind to them being anything but parts of Straw Gods that I was sort of, maybe these aren't even flashes anymore, you know, to anyone but me. And then when a magazine, I can't quite remember where they were, but it picked up and it said, we like 2 of these. It was, okay, they still work as flashes. But I do remember, I think it was down at Monaghan saying, after she wrote The Neverlands, she wished someone had told her that they don't all have to stand alone as pure flashes within a Novella-in-flash. She said, I wish I'd known that when I was doing it. That they are stories, they are complete, but they've got, you know, it's not a detached house. It's got
that's
street.
Definitely a rule that gets,
you know,
a rule that gets broken.
Yeah.
I agree.
I have one in.
I just think
Go on, Meg.
people can take that a bit too seriously about how they all have to be perfect individual flashes. I mean, they all have to have integrity, but it doesn't mean that they all have to be brilliant standalone publishable stories. And that I found out, you know, through trial and error. But it really, you know, a lot of the time they're great stories, but they, as standalone, they wouldn't be shining stars so much as they are when they are in sequence with the other pieces.
We're getting more questions coming in. Sorry, go on, Tom. Go on.
I was just going to say, I've got one in Homemade Weather that has a 0 word count. It's just a title. So as something to put in a magazine, that would be tricky, you know, but it works completely within the context of the thing. But it's just, you know, exactly as you say, you can get too carried away with the rules of it must be flash, Novella-in-flash. Well, it's part of the story, you know, and that I'm sticking to that.
So it's just a title. That story is.
Yeah, and it would be a spoiler to say what the title is, but yeah, I wasn't trying to pull this off, but then I mean, it's totally ruining the magic now, but I was just starting to say, I'll write that, I'll get to that, but it's really hard. And then I realized I don't need to write it. I've said it, it's there. It actually punches way harder if I just back away and keep my hands where I can see them, because I'm just going to mess it up. So, and then it worked, and it caught the eye, I think, even of the judges. It wasn't a deliberate stunt, but I'll take a freebie if it's going, if it's working, I'll have that. But it certainly doesn't sort of spoil it's sort of the rule that, no, it must be a standalone Flash. It would be, maybe, I guess it would be a 6-word story if we were to be, or something, or however many words. But so yeah, there isn't that kind of purity. Integrity is one thing, but they don't have to be. There's not a rule book yet. We seem to be writing the rules as we go along with this stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's interesting, Tom. Yeah, the rules aren't necessarily don't exist anywhere, and they're being created by people as everyone experiments. We probably have time for, I think, one more question. Let's see how we get on. So let me just scroll through here. So, question from Tom Walsh. Does an event, and I think he may be prompted by your Novella-in-flash, Tracy. He says, does an event, earthquake, flood, etc., provide enough connective tissue for a novella, or do the characters need to appear in more than one bit? So I guess what I'm hearing from that question is, can an event provide the linking material for a novella, or does it have to be linked by characters?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think it probably could. In fact, a Novella-in-flash would be an ideal form to just have an event at the heart of something, and then leap amidst characters and kind of give that kind of profusion of different angles and perspectives. I think it's a brilliant form to enable that kind of multiplicity of approaches to a single event or happening. But yes, the grip of my heroine and her voice and her embodiment was too strong for me to let go. I did think about it at one stage, having other voices, but she would not shut up, basically. It was her story. So, but I would absolutely, I've certainly written short stories. I don't know whether they would equate to Novella-in-flash, but that do take an event and then travel through different characters and different scenarios. Yeah.
I think the trick would be, if they tried that kind of experiment with the form, would be somehow still connecting and somehow still having an arc. But it'd be a really neat experiment, and it shows the power of the Novella-in-flash form, that you can have a title just be the story, or you can have a connected Novella-in-flash that doesn't have characters shared across any of the stories. I mean, I think that's a pretty neat idea of the experimentation that it allows. I'd like to read it.
Yeah, has anyone here read John Brantingham's Inland Empire Afternoon?
Yeah.
It was one of the novellas from 2019 or 2000, competition, I think. And it was about 45 pages, and there were 40 different characters, and it was all linked by a series of events that kind of toppled in, just like 4 or 5 things that toppled through the different chapters, and it's all set in one location on the west coast of America. So that would be an example. The question came from Tom Walsh. So Tom, you might like to seek out John Brantingham's Novella-in-flash, Inland Empire Afternoon, because that definitely does that. And there are a few others, I can't think of them off the top of my head, but there are a few others that are kind of multiple characters or ensemble cast, where people aren't necessarily returning regularly. Yeah. Let's see if we can squeeze one last question. I'm just aware that in the UK, we're now 10 minutes past 11 p.m. So probably our eyelids will start closing at some point. So one final question, which we'll just tackle briefly. So it's a question from Johanna Robinson. So novellas in Flash seem to enable a unique approach to place and location, allowing an immersion that other forms might struggle to achieve. What are your thoughts on how this aspect sets the Novella-in-flash apart? So is there something unique about the Novella-in-flash and place?
Well, for me, my Novella-in-flash was sparked by place and the people within that, and I tried to make the place a character in itself. So I don't think that I think it's very difficult in maybe a linear, non-fragmented, a form that resists fragment, the fragmentary, to allow someone to read and settle into place as a character in the same way that Novella-in-flash allows you to do. So I think it's in the way that we can play with point of view in the Novella-in-flash. I think you can do the same with setting, and also you can make again those sort of leaps that are, the tone doesn't need to be the same the whole way through, whereas a short story or something longer, or just a flash on its own, you kind of have to keep the tone, keep the register, and the transitions have to be smoother. And I think in Novella-in-flash, you can really play with that idea of setting and location in a way I don't think you find it anywhere else. I mean, William Glass, is it a Novella-in-flash? I don't think it is, but it's a short story that's fragmented, plays so much with that location, which was a great inspiration for what I was trying to do.
Any other final thoughts on this?
Yeah, place is a big influence for me as well, and I think place can be one of the joining elements, one of the things that does fuse all the different fragments of a Novella-in-flash together. Because while you might be blowing all the other aspects of structure out of the water, you're still returning to the same place over and over again. And I've definitely found it really influential. I mean, one of the other pieces that I've written that is possibly a Novella-in-flash before I even knew the form existed was in my second book of short stories, Deleted Scenes for Lovers. And it's called The Longest Drink in Town, and it was about a group of kids all at this particular intersection where there was a church, a pub, a service station, and a home show, kind of a place where they have representative homes from building companies on the side of the road. And I just kind of let the kids go wandering in those locations. So definitely place, I think, has a really fruitful and exciting and triggering place in the process.
We have about a minute left, I think. So Tom, I think there was something you wanted to add. Is there anything you wanted to say briefly?
It was really just the place issue that I've ended up writing, both the forthcoming homemade weather and One for the River ended up being in a fictionalized version of my own hometown, and I found writing about that freed me up in a way that writing about a fictional place like for Straw Gods was very reassuring from a writing point of view. I knew where everything was, so I could move the characters around in it much more freely and not worry, and I could get the essence of the thing in shorthand because I was just looking around from when I was 15. So it's that place can be useful, I think, not just for the reader but for the writer to sort of, okay, you've got your toy town set up, move them around in there now, and you can worry about the architecture later, whereas you don't have to invent it as you go. Okay, you still have 30 seconds left.
That's a really nice final point. Thank you, Tom. So just to say thank you to all our panelists this evening or this morning in New Zealand. I've really enjoyed hearing from everyone, and I also want to thank National Flash Fiction Day New Zealand for putting the event on, and Michelle Elvey for inviting us all. So round of applause for the panelists, and round of applause for Michelle Elvey and National Flash Fiction Day New Zealand. And also thank you to everyone that's been listening on the live stream, because I have been getting messages via National Flash Fiction Day with the questions. And I know some people maybe have had to sign off at slightly a few minutes ago because of the time, but thank you everyone for tuning in and listening and being part of this event. And with the questions you've sent in, it's really certainly helped, and we've had loads to talk about. We probably, if it wasn't for the time, we could have kept going for another 3 days. But so thank you everyone, and farewell, and I hope you will feel inspired to write your own novellas in Flash in the future.
And thank you, Michael.
Thank
Michael.
you.
Thank you very much, Mike.